June 29, 1974. Darmstadt, West Germany. The book lay open on Admiral Karl Dönitz's desk as he read page 117 of The Ultra Secret, the explosive memoir that had just reached German bookstores. His weathered hands gripped the edges of the volume as his eyes scanned the English text, translated for him by his aide, revealing truths that contradicted everything he had believed for 30 years. From May 1940 onwards, we read the German naval, army and air force traffic almost as quickly as the Germans themselves. At 83 years old, the last Führer of the Third Reich and former commander of Germany's U-boat fleet sat in stunned silence. According to his aide who was present, the Admiral's face drained of colour as the magnitude of the revelation struck him. For 3 decades since the war's end, he had blamed Allied radar, superior resources, and technological advantages for the destruction of his submarine force. The truth was far more devastating. Every order he had transmitted to his U-boats, every tactical innovation, every desperate attempt to win the Battle of the Atlantic, had been read by British intelligence often before his own commanders received them. Ich habe das schon immer geahnt. I had always suspected this, Dönitz would write in a hastily composed letter to the book's publisher days later. But this defensive rationalization rang hollow to those who knew him. Throughout the war, whenever subordinates had raised security concerns, Dönitz had dismissed them with absolute certainty. The Enigma cannot be broken. Now, sitting in his modest apartment in Aumühle, near Hamburg, the magnitude of the deception overwhelmed him. 783 submarines lost, 30,000 of his men dead beneath the Atlantic waves. And all because the encryption system he had trusted with unwavering faith had been systematically compromised since the 3rd year of the war. The mathematics that had guaranteed Enigma's security, its theoretical 3 times 10 to the power of 114 possible configurations, had meant nothing against Polish mathematicians, British cryptanalysts, and primitive computing machines he never knew existed. Every tactical decision, every operational order, every desperate innovation had been transparent to an enemy reading his most secret communications. The supreme confidence of German cryptographers rested on calculations that seemed unassailable. The standard 3-rotor Wehrmacht Enigma machine offered 17,576 possible rotor positions multiplied by 60 rotor arrangements, creating over 1 million primary configurations. When the plugboard connections were factored in, with their 150,738,274,937,250 possible combinations, the total number of configurations reached an astronomical 158,962,555,217,826,360,000 possibilities. Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, who headed the OKW/Chi, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht/Chiffrierwesen, the Wehrmacht's cipher department, understood the theoretical possibility of breaking Enigma through mathematical analysis. But as he would later tell Allied interrogators during the TICOM, Target Intelligence Committee, investigations in 1945, he found it impossible to imagine anyone going to the immense effort required. This wasn't mere hubris. It was a carefully calculated assessment based on the technology and resources available in the 1930s and early 1940s. To test every possible Enigma setting would require, by German calculations, teams of trained cryptanalysts working continuously for periods that exceeded the age of the universe. Even if the Allies possessed captured machines, without the daily changing keys distributed in carefully guarded codebooks, they would need to solve each day's settings anew, a task German mathematicians calculated would require thousands of trained operators working around the clock. The Kriegsmarine took additional precautions that seemed to guarantee absolute security. Admiral Dönitz had instituted the most stringent cryptographic protocols in the German military. Naval Enigma operators received specialized training at the Marine Nachrichtenschule in Flensburg-Mürwik, where they spent months learning not just the technical operation, but the security procedures that would supposedly make the system impregnable. Codebooks were printed in water-soluble red ink on pink paper that would dissolve within 30 seconds of water contact. Special weighted bags ensured the materials would sink immediately if thrown overboard. U-boat commanders carried personal sidearms with standing orders to shoot any crew member who failed to destroy cryptographic materials when capture seemed imminent. The introduction of the 4-rotor M4 Enigma machine for U-boats on February 1, 1942, codenamed Triton by the Germans and Shark by Allied cryptanalysts, represented what German naval intelligence considered the ultimate evolution in cryptographic security. With 8 rotors to choose from, compared to 5 for other services, and the 4th rotor adding another factor of complexity, the number of possible configurations increased by a factor of 26. German cryptanalysts at B-Dienst conducted their own security assessment, the 100-day project, 100-Tage Arbeit, attempting to break their own naval cipher using every known cryptanalytic technique. When all 3 attempts failed completely, Vice Admiral Erhard Mertens reported to Dönitz with complete confidence, "Our cipher does not appear to be broken." Throughout 1941 and 1942, inexplicable patterns began emerging that should have triggered alarm bells in German naval intelligence. Yet each incident was explained away, attributed to British radar, superior reconnaissance, or simple bad luck, anything except the possibility that Enigma had been compromised. The systematic destruction of German supply ships in the spring of 1941 represented the first major warning sign that went unheeded. Between March and June 1941, the Royal Navy intercepted and destroyed 7 of 9 German supply vessels stationed in remote areas of the Atlantic to refuel and resupply surface raiders and U-boats. The Bletchley, positioned 300 miles north of the Azores, was discovered on March 3rd. The SO Hamburg, hidden in a remote bay, fell on March 5th. The Egeland and Nordmark followed in quick succession. These ships had been positioned in locations so remote that chance discovery seemed statistically impossible. The probability of British patrols accidentally finding vessels in millions of square miles of ocean approached 0. Yet when Captain Ludwig Stummel of the B-Dienst investigated these losses, his report concluded that British success must be attributed to improved radar technology and systematic ocean surveillance. The possibility that the British were reading German position reports remained unconsidered in the official investigation. The destruction of the Bismarck in May 1941 should have raised even more serious questions. Germany's most powerful battleship, pride of the Kriegsmarine, was hunted down with uncanny precision after breaking into the Atlantic. When Luftwaffe General Hans Jeschonek received reports that British aircraft seemed to know exactly where to search in the vast expanses of the Norwegian Sea and North Atlantic, he dismissed subordinates' security concerns with crushing certainty. "It is impossible that the enemy is reading our ciphers." Our specialists have established this beyond doubt. But nowhere was the hidden catastrophe more evident than in the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boat losses began climbing steadily from late 1941 onwards, despite tactical innovations and technological improvements. Dönitz noted in his war diary entry for January 12, 1942, his mystification at the interception of supply submarine U-459 in an impossibly remote location 800 nautical miles west of Freetown. His inquiry to Berlin brought the standard response from naval intelligence: "An insight into our cipher does not come into consideration." The statistics told a story of systematic destruction that defied conventional explanation. In 1941, Germany lost 35 U-boats. In 1942, despite adding the 4th rotor to Enigma machines, losses climbed to 85. By 1943, they reached catastrophic proportions: 237 submarines destroyed in a single year. May 1943 alone, Black May, as German submariners called it, saw 41 U-boats sent to the bottom, representing over 1/3 of all boats at sea. Yet German analysts consistently found alternative explanations. When convoys began taking seemingly impossible evasive actions, avoiding wolf packs with uncanny precision, Dönitz blamed Allied aircraft equipped with new radar systems. When U-boats were caught on the surface with disturbing frequency, German scientists theorized that the British had developed radar capable of detecting submarines at ranges up to 60 nautical miles, a technological impossibility at the time, but more believable to German minds than cryptographic compromise. The mounting losses triggered increasingly desperate investigations by German intelligence, each more thorough than the last, yet all suffering from the same fundamental blind spot, the unshakable assumption that Enigma remained secure. The most telling investigation began after the capture of U-570 by the British on August 27, 1941. The submarine had surrendered to a British Hudson bomber after suffering damage south of Iceland, potentially intact with all its cryptographic materials. Captain Ludwig Stummel of B-Dienst was assigned to investigate the security implications. His investigation was meticulous, interviewing survivors, analysing the submarine's last messages, and reconstructing the probable timeline of its capture. Stummel's October 1941 report revealed the cognitive trap that would persist throughout the war. He acknowledged that if the British had captured the Enigma machine and codebooks intact, they could theoretically read German naval traffic. But he immediately dismissed this possibility. The acute disquiet about the compromise of our secret operation cannot be justified. Our cipher does not appear to be broken. His reasoning followed what seemed like impeccable logic. Even if the British possessed the machine and current keys, they would lose this capability when the keys changed on November 1st. Furthermore, proper protocol demanded the destruction of all cryptographic materials, and it must be assumed that the crew fulfilled their duty. What Stummel couldn't know was that U-110 had been captured intact 3 months earlier on May 9, 1941, providing the British with not just an Enigma machine, but the crucial codebooks and operating procedures. The boarding party from HMS Bulldog, led by Sub-Lieutenant David Bombe, had found the submarine's radio room undisturbed, with codebooks spread on the table, and the Enigma machine still warm from use. Among the captured materials were the settings for high-level officer-only signals and the short-signal codebooks, Kurzsignaler, that revealed how Germans compressed messages to defeat Allied direction-finding efforts. The investigation that should have exposed everything came in spring 1943, prompted by the catastrophic losses of Black May. Admiral Dönitz, desperate to understand why his wolf packs were being systematically destroyed, ordered the most comprehensive security review of the war. The investigation team, led by Korvettenkapitän Meckel, explored multiple hypotheses with impressive thoroughness. Their first theory involved the METOX radar warning receivers carried by U-boats. German scientists hypothesized that these devices might be re-radiating signals that betrayed submarine positions. A Focke-Wulf 200 Condor aircraft equipped with detection equipment confirmed that METOX emissions could indeed be detected at ranges up to 110 kilometers. All U-boats were immediately ordered to cease using radar detection equipment. When losses continued unabated, the investigation moved to the next theory. Perhaps, they reasoned, the Allies had developed infrared detection systems capable of spotting the heat signatures of submarine diesels. German naval technical departments launched a crash program to develop special infrared-absorbing paint, and U-boats returning from patrol were hastily repainted with this experimental coating. Still, the losses mounted. The breakthrough seemed to come when a crashed RAF bomber near Rotterdam yielded an intact H-2S radar system on February 3, 1943. German scientists were stunned to discover the British had developed centimetric radar operating on wavelengths their detection equipment couldn't receive. This revelation triggered another crash program to develop new detection gear, with the first Naxos radar detectors reaching U-boats in September 1943. Throughout these investigations, one hypothesis remained notably absent from serious consideration. As Admiral Erhard Martens, head of the Naval Intelligence Service, reasoned in his 1941 assessment, breaking Enigma would require a perfect chain of unlikely events: the capture of machines and current keys, the solution of security procedures, the breaking of officer-only signals, and sufficient time for cryptanalysis before keys changed. He concluded these requirements were, taken singly, unlikely, and together impossible. Paradoxically, Germany's own success in breaking Allied codes reinforced their faith in Enigma's security. Bedienst, the German Naval Intelligence Service, had achieved remarkable success penetrating British naval ciphers, and this achievement convinced German leadership they understood the game being played. Kapitän zur See Heinz Bonatz, who led Bedienst's English language section, had broken the British naval cipher number, 3 used for convoy communications. By December 1942, his team was reading 80% of intercepted British convoy messages, often within hours of transmission. Wilhelm Tranow, Germany's most gifted naval cryptanalyst, could predict convoy movements 10 to 20 hours in advance, allowing U-boats to position themselves perfectly for intercept. This success created a dangerous psychological dynamic. German naval intelligence officers reasoned that if breaking codes required such enormous effort and specialized talent, Bedienst employed over 5,000 personnel at its peak, then surely the British faced similar or greater challenges attacking Enigma. They knew from experience that even with captured codebooks, maintaining continuous access to enemy communications required constant vigilance and frequent failures when codes changed. What they failed to recognize was that while they celebrated reading British convoy routes, the British were reading virtually everything else: U-boat positions, patrol orders, supply arrangements, tactical innovations, even Dönitz's personal assessments sent to Hitler. The Germans were winning tactical victories while losing the strategic war, but their tactical successes blinded them to the strategic catastrophe. The supreme irony came in spring 1943, when Bedienst's success actually accelerated German defeat. Reading British convoy communications, Tranow could position wolf packs with perfect precision. But the British, reading both German positioning orders and their own compromised communications, knew exactly where the U-boats were gathering. They would route convoys around the wolf packs while vectoring hunter-killer groups directly onto the waiting submarines. The Germans celebrated their code-breaking success even as their U-boats sailed into carefully prepared traps. Captain Heinz Bonatz would later write in his unpublished memoirs about his growing suspicions in late 1943. The enemy seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of our dispositions. Convoys would alter course at the last possible moment, always just beyond our patrol lines. Supply submarines were caught at remote refueling points. It was as if they could see our operations unfolding. Yet when he raised these concerns, he was told repeatedly that Enigma's security had been mathematically proven. The preservation of the ultra-secret, the code name for intelligence derived from broken Enigma traffic, represented one of the most successful deception operations in military history. Winston Churchill, who famously called Bletchley Park the goose that laid the golden eggs but never cackled, understood that the strategic advantage of reading German communications far outweighed any tactical benefit from acting on specific intelligence. The security architecture surrounding Ultra was unprecedented in its scope and effectiveness. Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham, appointed by the Secret Intelligence Service Chief Stuart Menzies, established the Special Liaison Unit SLU system in 1940. These units, eventually numbering 40 worldwide, maintained absolute control over ultra-intelligence distribution. Each SLU officer was personally vetted by Winterbotham and signed the Official Secrets Act with the understanding that violation meant execution for treason, even after the war ended. The physical security measures at Bletchley Park itself bordered on paranoia. The estate's 580 acres were surrounded by military police posts, with over 9,000 personnel working in complete compartmentalization. Codebreakers in Hut 8 working on naval Enigma had no knowledge of work in Hut 6 on Wehrmacht traffic. Even within huts, personnel knew only their specific task. A translator might spend years rendering German messages into English without knowing their source or significance. To mask the source of ultra-intelligence, the British created increasingly elaborate deceptions. The original cover story involved a fictional super-spy network codenamed Boniface, supposedly run by an anti-Nazi German officer in Berlin with access to highest-level communications. When acting on ultra-intelligence, false reconnaissance flights were routinely conducted to provide plausible discovery stories. After using ultra-intelligence to destroy an Italian convoy bound for North Africa, the British transmitted a radio message in a cipher they knew the Germans had broken, thanking a non-existent agent in Naples for the vital information. The most sophisticated deception involved the careful calibration of action versus inaction. The Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Centre, under Commander Roger Wynne, developed precise protocols for using ultra-intelligence. Attacks on U-boats were timed to occur only after plausible detection opportunities, a chance aircraft sighting or surface vessel contact. When Ultra revealed U-boat refueling rendezvous, attacks were delayed until the submarines had been together long enough that discovery might seem coincidental. Sometimes preserving Ultra meant accepting terrible losses. On November 14, 1940, German bombers devastated Coventry in a raid that killed 568 civilians. Post-war mythology claimed Churchill knew from Enigma decrypts that Coventry was the target but refused to evacuate the city to protect Ultra. Declassified documents reveal a more complex truth. Enigma had revealed Operation Moonlight Sonata was planned but initially indicated 5 possible targets. When radio beam navigation finally confirmed Coventry as the target just hours before the raid, immediate defensive measures were taken, including fighter patrols and anti-aircraft reinforcements. The story of Churchill's sacrifice was itself a post-war deception to hide the actual capabilities and limitations of ultra-intelligence. March 25, 1941. In Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, a young woman named Mavis Lever, later Beatty, sat hunched over intercepted Italian naval messages. She had been working 16-hour days attempting to break the Italian naval Enigma variant, and suddenly the patterns clicked. The message she decoded was electric in its implications. Today, 25th March, is day -3 for the start of the operation. Mavis immediately understood the significance. The Italian fleet was planning a major operation in exactly 3 days. Working through the night with her colleague Margaret Rock, she decoded additional messages revealing the complete Italian battle plan. Admiral Angelo Iachino would sortie with the battleship Vittorio Veneto, 6 heavy cruisers, and 17 destroyers to attack British convoys between Egypt and Greece. The intelligence reached Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the British Mediterranean Fleet in Alexandria, within hours. Cunningham, a theatrical commander who understood the importance of deception, spent March 27th ostentatiously playing golf at the Alexandria Sporting Club, ensuring Italian spies would report the British fleet showed no signs of preparation. That night, after returning to his flagship HMS Warspite with studied casualness, he ordered the fleet to sea. The Italian fleet had no idea they were sailing into a carefully prepared ambush. British torpedo bombers from the carrier HMS Formidable struck first, damaging Vittorio Veneto and crippling the heavy cruiser Pola. When Italian cruisers Zara and Fiume returned to assist Pola after dark, they sailed directly into the guns of Cunningham's battleships at point-blank range. In minutes, both cruisers and 2 destroyers were destroyed. Over 2,400 Italian sailors died, including Admiral Carlo Cataneo and the captains of all 3 lost cruisers. Admiral Iachino, surviving aboard the damaged Vittorio Veneto, attributed the disaster to British radar superiority and lucky reconnaissance. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The enemy's discovery of our force must be attributed to their superior aerial reconnaissance and radar technology, which allowed them to track our movements even at night. The possibility that the British had been reading Italian naval orders for days never entered Italian or German analysis. The psychological impact rippled through Axis naval planning. Hitler, already sceptical of surface naval warfare after the loss of the Graf Spee, saw Matapan as confirmation that the Mediterranean was a British lake. The Italian fleet, which had posed a significant threat to British convoys, never again attempted major offensive operations. Yet through it all, neither Italian nor German intelligence suspected that cryptanalysis, not reconnaissance or radar, had orchestrated their destruction. May 18, 1941, 11:30 p.m. At Bletchley Park, the teleprinter in Hut 8 clattered to life with an intercepted German naval message. Harry Hinsley, a 21-year-old Cambridge undergraduate turned cryptanalyst, recognised its significance immediately. The message, from Admiral Günther Lütjens aboard the battleship Bismarck, reported his departure from Gotenhafen, modern Gdynia, for Operation Rheinübung, an Atlantic commerce raiding mission. The British Admiralty had been anticipating this moment for months. Bismarck represented the greatest threat to Atlantic convoys since the war began. With its 8 15-inch guns and advanced fire control systems, it could destroy any British cruiser and outrun any battleship capable of fighting it. If Bismarck reached the Atlantic shipping lanes, the massacre would be unprecedented. But forewarned by ultra-intelligence, the Royal Navy had time to prepare. Admiral John Tovey positioned the home fleet to intercept, while Force H under Admiral James Somerville moved north from Gibraltar. The cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk were stationed in the Denmark Strait with specific orders to shadow using their new Type 284 radar. Every movement had been choreographed based on intercepted German messages. When Bismarck was finally spotted in the Denmark Strait on May 23rd, the British painted the discovery as lucky reconnaissance by the cruiser HMS Suffolk. In reality, ultra-intelligence had revealed not just Bismarck's route, but its precise timetable. The subsequent battle that destroyed HMS Hood was a tactical disaster the British hadn't anticipated, but strategic victory was already assured. Bismarck was now damaged, leaking oil, and tracked by radar-equipped shadowers whose positions were updated by continuing Enigma intercepts. On May 25th, Admiral Lütjens made a fatal error. Unaware that British radar contact had been temporarily lost, he transmitted a long radio message to Naval Group West describing his damage and intentions. The transmission lasted over 30 minutes, more than enough time for British direction-finding stations to plot his position. But more importantly, the message was decoded at Bletchley Park within hours, revealing that Bismarck was heading for Brest and had insufficient fuel for evasive manoeuvring. The final act unfolded with grim inevitability. Catalina flying boats, accidentally, spotted Bismarck precisely where ultra-intelligence placed it. Swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Ark Royal, operating at the extreme limit of their range in terrible weather, somehow managed to score the critical hit that jammed Bismarck's rudder. On the morning of May 27th, the converging British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney pounded Bismarck into scrap metal. Of 2,221 German sailors aboard, only 114 survived. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, analysed the disaster with growing frustration. How had the British maintained contact across thousands of miles of ocean? How had they concentrated overwhelming force at precisely the right moment? His investigation concluded that British naval aviation and radar technology had advanced beyond German expectations. The possibility that the British had been reading his every order never entered consideration. In his memoirs, written years before Ultra was revealed, Raeder attributed the loss to unfortunate mechanical failure and the enemy's lucky torpedo, hit, never suspecting that luck had nothing to do with it. May 1943 began with Admiral Dönitz commanding the largest U-boat fleet in history. 116 submarines patrolled the North Atlantic, organised into wolf packs with predatory names: Fink, Finch, Amsel, Blackbird, Miser, Tit and Star. German B-Dienst cryptanalysts were reading British convoy codes, and Dönitz felt victory was within reach. "The enemy is showing signs of exhaustion," he wrote in his war diary on May 1st. "One more concentrated effort and the Atlantic supply line will be cut." What Dönitz couldn't know was that Bletchley Park had achieved a cryptanalytic breakthrough that would seal his fleet's fate. After a 10-month blackout caused by the introduction of the four-rotor Enigma, British cryptanalysts had finally mastered the M4 cipher. Using captured codebooks from U-559, recovered by sailors who drowned retrieving them from the sinking submarine, and the world's first programmable electronic computer, Colossus, they were again reading German naval traffic within hours of transmission. The first convoy battle of May set the pattern for the slaughter to come. Convoy ONS-5, consisting of 42 merchantmen bound from Liverpool to Halifax, was spotted by U-650 on April 28th. Dönitz concentrated 3 wolf packs, 41 U-boats in total, for the attack. Reading his every order, the Admiralty reinforced the convoy's escort and routed additional forces to intercept. The battle raged for 6 days across 600 miles of ocean. German submarines sank 13 merchant ships, but at a terrible cost. 7 U-boats were destroyed by the convoy escorts. U-192, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Werner Happe, was depth-charged by HMS Loosestrife. U-638 went down with all hands after being rammed by HMS Sunflower. U-125, U-531, U-438, U-630, and U-528 followed in quick succession. For the first time in the war, the exchange rate favoured the Allies, but this was just the beginning. As May progressed, each convoy battle became a massacre of German submarines. Reading German deployment orders, the Allies routed convoys through gaps in the patrol lines, while vectoring hunter-killer groups directly onto Wolfpack assembly points. Aircraft equipped with new Lee lights caught U-boats charging batteries on the surface at night. Ships equipped with Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars achieved kill rates that stunned their own commanders. Convoy HX-237, crossing in mid-May, destroyed 3 U-boats without losing a single merchant vessel. Convoy SC-130 sank 5 submarines while suffering no losses. The new escort carrier USS Bogue, operating with perfect intelligence from Ultra, sank 6 U-boats in as many weeks. German submarines were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and experienced commanders who had survived years of warfare were dying in waters they had once dominated. The statistics were catastrophic. In May 1943, Germany lost 41 U-boats, nearly 25% of its operational fleet. 7 were destroyed by aircraft in the Bay of Biscay, trying to leave or return to base. 6 were caught refueling from submarine tankers at coordinates revealed by Ultra. 12 were killed by convoy escorts that seemed to anticipate their every move. The youngest victim was U-209 on its first patrol, destroyed with all 50 hands on May 7th. The most experienced was U-192, whose commander had survived 12 previous patrols, sent to the bottom on May 6th. On May 24th, Dönitz issued the order that marked the effective end of the Battle of the Atlantic. All U-boats were to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes and regroup in waters southwest of the Azores. In his war diary, he wrote, "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." He attributed the defeat to Allied radar and aircraft, never suspecting that his own communications had orchestrated the destruction of his fleet. One of the most remarkable aspects of the ultra-secret was how close the Germans came to discovering the truth, only to be deliberately misdirected by Allied intelligence. The most sophisticated of these deceptions involved the Lucy Ring, a Soviet spy network operating from Switzerland that seemed to have extraordinary access to German military secrets. Rudolf Rösler, codenamed Lucy, was a German refugee publisher living in Lucerne who ran a supposedly independent intelligence network. From 1942 onwards, Lucy provided Soviet intelligence with remarkably accurate information about German military operations, particularly on the Eastern Front. His reports included detailed Wehrmacht order of battle, offensive plans, and even verbatim texts of Hitler's operational directives, information so precise and timely that both German and Soviet intelligence suspected it came from highest-level sources within the Wehrmacht. German counterintelligence launched multiple investigations into the Lucy Ring, convinced they had a major traitor in their high command. The Abwehr and Gestapo investigated dozens of senior officers, including members of the Wehrmacht operations staff with access to Enigma traffic. What they never discovered was that Lucy's information came not from traitors, but from Bletchley Park, laundered through Swiss intelligence to disguise its true source. The British faced a delicate problem. Soviet forces desperately needed ultra-intelligence to counter German offensives, but Stalin was deeply suspicious of British motives and unlikely to trust intelligence from capitalist allies. Moreover, directly sharing ultra with the Soviets risked exposure through their less secure communication methods and potential German agents within Soviet intelligence. The solution was elegant. Ultra-intelligence was selectively passed to Swiss intelligence, who fed it to Rösler with the cover story that it came from anti-Nazi officers in the Wehrmacht. Rösler then transmitted it to Soviet intelligence through his handler Alexander Rado. The Soviets, believing they had their own source independent of the Western Allies, acted on the intelligence with confidence. The Germans, discovering the accuracy of Lucy's reports through their own agents, launched investigations that pointed everywhere except Bletchley Park. Throughout 1943 and 1944, evidence of Allied foreknowledge accumulated to levels that should have been undeniable. Yet German investigators, trapped by their fundamental assumption of Enigma's security, consistently found alternative explanations. The systematic destruction of U-boat supply submarines provided the most obvious evidence. These milk cow submarines operated at secret refueling points in remote areas of the Atlantic, their positions known only to U-boat command, and the submarines they were scheduled to supply. Between June and August 1943, 10 of 14 supply submarines were destroyed, most caught at their refueling coordinates. U-459, destroyed on July 24th while refueling U-117, went down at a position 500 miles from the nearest shipping lane. U-489 was caught on August 4th at coordinates that had been transmitted just 48 hours earlier. Captain zur See Hermann Mohr, investigating these losses for naval intelligence, wrote in his report, "The probability of chance discovery of our supply operations is mathematically negligible. Either the enemy has developed detection capabilities beyond our current understanding, or we have a serious breach of security." Yet his investigation focused entirely on possible human intelligence sources, crew members who might have been turned, neutral sailors who might have observed departure patterns, even the possibility of Allied agents with radio transmitters near French bases. The idea that the British were simply reading German position reports was never seriously considered. Even more damning evidence came from the precision of Allied operations against new German weapons and tactics. When Germany introduced the acoustic torpedo in September 1943, designed to home in on convoy escort propellers, the Allies immediately deployed effective countermeasures, noise-making devices towed behind escorts that decoyed the torpedoes. The German explanation: Allied intelligence must have captured sample torpedoes from destroyed U-boats. When U-boats began using new Courier burst radio transmissions in 1944, compressing messages into less than half a second to defeat direction finding, Allied forces still managed to locate and attack submarines with disturbing accuracy. The German conclusion: the Allies must have developed direction-finding equipment capable of detecting even these brief transmissions. The Japanese naval attaché in Berlin, Captain Yokoi Tadao, provided perhaps the most telling observation. After analysing the pattern of Allied operations in 1944, he reported to Tokyo, The precision of enemy intelligence suggests they are reading German communications. This seems impossible given German security measures, but no other explanation fits the evidence. His report, intercepted and decoded by American cryptanalysts who had broken Japanese diplomatic codes, caused brief concern at Bletchley Park. Fortunately, German naval intelligence dismissed Japanese concerns as face-saving excuses for their own intelligence failures in the Pacific. Admiral Karl Dönitz represented perhaps the most tragic figure in the story of German cryptographic blindness. Widely regarded as a brilliant tactician and inspirational leader, his very competence became a barrier to recognizing the truth. His centralized command system, which he considered his greatest innovation, had become the instrument of his fleet's destruction. Dönitz had revolutionized submarine warfare through his Befehlstaktik, centralized tactical control from his headquarters. Using powerful radio transmitters, he personally directed Wolfpack operations from situation rooms in Lorient, Paris, and finally Berlin. Every U-boat commander reported position, fuel state, torpedo inventory, and contact reports. Dönitz would then orchestrate attacks like a conductor directing a symphony, vectoring boats onto convoys with precise timing and positioning. This system required constant radio communication, exactly what allowed Bletchley Park to track every U-boat in the Atlantic. Dönitz transmitted over 70 radio messages daily to his fleet, each one decoded by British cryptanalysts. His detailed orders revealed not just current positions, but future intentions, patrol patterns, and tactical innovations. Yet Dönitz's faith in his system never wavered. When subordinates questioned the wisdom of such extensive radio traffic, he responded with detailed technical explanations. The Enigma was unbreakable by computational standards. German radio discipline was superior to any navy in history. Short signal codebooks compressed messages to defeat direction finding. Frequency changes and call sign modifications prevented traffic analysis. In his mind, German technical superiority guaranteed security. His war diary reveals a commander increasingly frustrated by inexplicable Allied prescience, but never questioning his fundamental assumptions. Entry after entry describes convoys taking impossible evasive actions, escorts appearing at unlikely positions, aircraft catching U-boats at improbable moments. Yet his conclusions remained consistent. The Allies had more aircraft, better radar, superior resources. Never once did he write the obvious conclusion, "They are reading our mail." The psychological investment in his command system made recognition impossible. To admit Enigma was compromised would mean acknowledging that his entire approach to submarine warfare, the very innovation that had made him Hitler's chosen successor, had been fundamentally flawed. Every order he had given, every tactical innovation he had developed, every submarine he had sent to its death had been transparent to the enemy. The weight of such knowledge would have been crushing. Even after the war, before Ultra's revelation, Dönitz maintained absolute confidence in his wartime decisions. His memoirs, published in 1958, attributed U-boat losses to Allied material superiority and technological advancement. He calculated that Germany would have needed 300 submarines operational simultaneously to cut Britain's supply lines, never realizing that even 3,000 would have failed if the Allies continued reading his every command. May 9, 1946. International Military Tribunal, Nuremberg. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood in the dock, defending his conduct of submarine warfare before Allied prosecutors. His testimony that day would unknowingly reveal the depth of German ignorance about Ultra, while simultaneously demonstrating how close he had come to the truth. The enemy's superiority in locating our submarines was overwhelming, Dönitz testified. By 1943, our losses had reached insupportable levels. I was forced to withdraw from the convoy routes. When pressed by prosecutors about specific incidents, Dönitz's explanations consistently avoided the real cause. Regarding the destruction of supply submarines at remote coordinates, he stated, "We suspected that the enemy had developed new long-range detection equipment, possibly using infrared or other emanations we could not detect. We also investigated the possibility of traitors, but found no evidence. When asked about convoys that seemed to avoid wolf packs with supernatural precision, Dönitz replied, "The enemy's air reconnaissance had reached saturation levels. They could maintain almost continuous surveillance of vast ocean areas. Combined with their radar capabilities, they could track our movements and route convoys accordingly." The prosecution, fully aware of ultra but bound by secrecy that would last another 28 years, pressed Dönitz on specific intelligence failures without revealing their source. They asked about the interception of U-459 at precise refueling coordinates, the destruction of wolf packs at assembly points, the failure of every major tactical innovation within weeks of implementation. To each question, Dönitz had a technical explanation: high-frequency direction finding, centimetric radar, talk between ships, TBS, radio systems that allowed instant coordination of escort groups, air-to-surface vessel radar, magnetic anomaly detection equipment, sonobuoys. Each explanation was partially correct. These technologies did exist and were employed, but none addressed the fundamental intelligence advantage that made their application so devastating. The most telling exchange came when prosecutor Sir David Maxwell Fyfe questioned Dönitz about his investigations into security breaches. "Admiral, did you at any time suspect your communications were compromised?" "I investigated this possibility multiple times. Our cryptographic experts assured me that Enigma was mathematically secure. Breaking it would require resources beyond any nation's capability." "Yet your losses continued to mount." "Yes, but this was due to enemy technological superiority, not intelligence failure. They had radar that could detect a periscope at 20 miles, aircraft that could appear without warning, weapons systems we could not counter." "You never suspected they might be reading your radio traffic?" "Our communications were protected by the most sophisticated encryption system in existence. The possibility you suggest was examined and conclusively rejected by our finest mathematical minds." What makes this testimony particularly poignant in hindsight was Dönitz's obvious intelligence and analytical capability. His IQ had been tested at 138, well into the gifted range. He had correctly identified many Allied capabilities and innovations. He had asked the right questions and demanded thorough investigations. Yet the mental barrier created by faith in Enigma's security proved impermeable. Perhaps the most damning evidence of German institutional blindness came on August 10, 1943, when Swiss intelligence, neutral and generally reliable, provided an explicit warning that should have triggered immediate action. The Swiss intelligence service, through sources that remain classified to this day, had learned of Allied cryptanalytic success against German naval codes. Their report, delivered through diplomatic channels to Admiral Canaris of the Abwehr, was stark in its implications. Over the last few months, Germany's naval ciphers, which are used to give operational orders to the U-boats, have been successfully broken. All orders are being read currently. The German response revealed the depth of their psychological investment in Enigma's security. Dönitz, informed of the Swiss report, wrote in his war diary on August 13th, "Report from Switzerland claims enemy is reading our cipher. This is unbelievable." He ordered yet another security review, but with predetermined conclusions. The investigation, led by Korvettenkapitän Meckel, dismissed the Swiss intelligence as Allied disinformation designed to undermine German confidence in their communications. The investigating committee's reasoning was revealing. If the Allies could read German naval communications, why hadn't they achieved even more devastating victories? Why did some convoys still blunder into wolf packs? Why did U-boats sometimes successfully evade hunter-killer groups? These questions had simple answers. The Allies deliberately allowed some losses to preserve their secret, but German investigators couldn't imagine such strategic restraint. German counterintelligence also investigated the source of Swiss information. They concluded it must have come from Allied agents attempting to create paranoia within the German Naval Command. The possibility that Swiss intelligence had simply observed the obvious, that Allied operations showed clear evidence of foreknowledge, was never seriously considered. The German failure to conceive of Bletchley Park's operation stemmed partly from their inability to imagine the technological and organizational innovations that made industrial-scale code-breaking possible. German cryptanalysts worked with paper, pencils, and mechanical calculating machines. The idea of electronic computation, of machines that could test thousands of Enigma settings per hour, existed only in the realm of science fiction. By 1944, Bletchley Park had become the world's first industrial-scale computing centre. The Colossus machines, designed by Tommy Flowers and absolutely secret even within Bletchley Park, could process 5,000 characters per second, a speed that German mathematicians wouldn't have believed possible. The Bombe machines, developed from Polish designs by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, could test over 17,000 Enigma positions in 20 minutes, work that would take human cryptanalysts months. The organizational structure was equally beyond German imagination. Bletchley Park employed over 9,000 people by 1945, including 80% women who operated the machines, transcribed intercepts, and managed the vast filing systems that tracked millions of decoded messages. 3 shifts operated 24 hours daily, processing over 3,000 intercepted messages per day at peak capacity. Messages were prioritized by operational importance, with U-boat communications receiving highest priority for naval intelligence. The systematic approach to cryptanalysis would have amazed German experts. Every Enigma message ever decoded was filed and cross-referenced. Patterns in operator behavior were catalogued. Lazy operators who used girlfriends' names as message keys, predictable weather reports that provided cribs, standard military phrases that appeared in routine communications. The British had industrialized a process Germans still considered an art. German cryptanalysts later expressed astonishment at the resources devoted to breaking Enigma. Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, when interrogated by TICOM in 1945 and told of Bletchley Park's scale, reportedly said, "No wonder you broke it. You treated cryptanalysis like building bombers, mass production. We treated it like writing poetry, individual genius." A critical moment of near discovery came on November 30, 1943, when a British Lancaster bomber was shot down near Berlin. Among the wreckage, German investigators found something that should have triggered immediate alarm: a partially burned document containing what appeared to be German naval grid references and U-boat positions, dated just 48 hours earlier. Hauptmann Wilhelm Dommes of Luftwaffe Intelligence was assigned to investigate. The document was fragmentary, but clearly showed positions of 3 U-boats, U-391, U-238, and U-648, at coordinates that matched their actual locations on November 28th. This intelligence was far too precise and recent to have come from aerial reconnaissance or agent reports. Dommes's investigation was thorough, but ultimately misdirected. He concluded the British must have an extensive network of agents in French ports reporting U-boat departures and returns. Combined with direction-finding fixes on German radio transmissions, this could theoretically allow rough position estimates. The possibility that the British were reading actual German position reports was mentioned in his report, but dismissed with a single sentence: "Cryptographic compromise has been ruled out by technical experts." The close call caused brief panic at Bletchley Park when they learned through ultra-intercepts that the Germans had recovered intelligence documents. Emergency procedures were implemented. For the next 3 months, ultra-intelligence was distributed with even more elaborate cover stories, and any intelligence that couldn't be plausibly attributed to other sources was withheld from operational use. The D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, represented Ultra's greatest triumph and the most complete failure of German intelligence. Despite the largest amphibious invasion in history, involving over 6,000 vessels and 150,000 troops in the first wave, German forces were caught completely by surprise. The preservation of tactical surprise when strategic surprise was impossible demonstrated the totality of Allied intelligence dominance. Through Ultra, the Allies knew exactly what German commanders believed. Every assessment by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, every defensive preparation ordered by Rommel, every intelligence estimate submitted to Hitler was read at Bletchley Park, often before German recipients decoded their own copies. This allowed the Allies to craft deception operations with surgical precision. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan that convinced Germans the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais, succeeded because the Allies could monitor German reactions in real time through Ultra. When German intelligence reported strong Allied forces massing opposite Calais, actually inflatable tanks and fictional radio traffic, the Allies could read German assessments and adjust their deception accordingly. When Germans expressed doubts, new evidence was provided to reinforce the deception. Even after D-Day began, ultra-intercepts of German communications revealed they still believed Normandy was a diversion. Hitler's refusal to release panzer reserves from Calais for 7 crucial weeks stemmed partly from intelligence assessments the Allies were reading and reinforcing through continued deception operations. German commanders were not just surprised, they were fighting a battle orchestrated by enemies reading their every thought. Admiral Theodor Kranke, commanding Naval Group West, would later write about the invasion's intelligence failure. "We knew nothing. Our reconnaissance was blind, our intelligence was deaf. The enemy appeared from nowhere with overwhelming force. He never suspected that rather than knowing nothing, the problem was that the Allies knew everything." By late 1944, accumulating anomalies should have shattered German faith in their communications security. U-boats equipped with new snorkel technology, allowing them to remain submerged for entire patrols, were still being caught with disturbing frequency. New acoustic torpedoes were countered before they achieved significant success. Tactical innovations were met with immediate Allied adaptations. Yet German investigations continued to find alternative explanations. When Schnorkel boats were destroyed, investigators blamed improved Allied sonar and magnetic anomaly detection. When new Wolfpack tactics failed, they attributed it to Allied air saturation of operational areas. When supply operations were consistently intercepted, they theorized about infrared detection of diesel exhaust or wake patterns visible from high altitude. The most telling incident occurred in March 1945, when U-866 was destroyed off the American coast just days after departing Norway. The submarine had maintained complete radio silence, using only Schnorkel and travelling a route known only to U-boat command. Its destruction at precise coordinates should have been impossible without communications intelligence. Yet the German investigation concluded American hunter-killer groups had achieved such density off their coast that detection was inevitable. Captain Günther Hessler, Dönitz's son-in-law and chief of U-boat operations, came closest to the truth in April 1945. In a staff meeting, he reportedly said, "Either the Americans have technology beyond our comprehension, or they are reading our thoughts." The response from Admiral Gott, Dönitz's chief of staff, was swift and dismissive. "Defeatist thinking will not be tolerated. Our communications remain secure." May 1945. As the Third Reich collapsed, Allied intelligence teams raced across Germany in Operation TICOM, Target Intelligence Committee, tasked with capturing German cryptographic personnel and materials before they could be destroyed or fall into Soviet hands. What they discovered was a mixture of sophisticated cryptanalytic capability and stunning blindness to their own vulnerabilities. The interrogation of Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, chief cryptanalyst of OKW/Chi, provided remarkable insights into German thinking. When told that the Allies had been reading Enigma traffic since 1940, Hüttenhain's first response was disbelief. Impossible. The mathematical complexity is insurmountable. When shown actual decoded messages, his shock was complete. but this would require thousands of people and resources beyond imagination. When interrogators explained the scale of Bletchley Park's operation, Huttenhein's response revealed the conceptual gap that had protected Ultra. "We calculated that breaking Enigma would require more resources than any nation would rationally devote to cryptanalysis. We never imagined you would treat it as a military priority equivalent to building aircraft or training divisions." Wilhelm Trano, the brilliant B-Dienst cryptanalyst who had broken British convoy codes, was equally stunned. During his TICOM interrogation, he admitted, "We knew something was wrong. Too many coincidences, too many lucky discoveries. But whenever I suggested cryptographic compromise, I was told I was being paranoid. Breaking Enigma was a mathematical impossibility." The interrogation of lower-level personnel revealed widespread suspicions that had been systematically suppressed. Radio operators reported that they had noticed patterns suggesting Allied foreknowledge. U-boat commanders had questioned how convoys always seemed to zigzag at the perfect moment. Intelligence analysts had documented statistical impossibilities in Allied success rates. But at every level, these concerns had been dismissed with the same response: Enigma cannot be broken. Perhaps most revealing was the interrogation of Korvettenkapitän Heinz Bonatz, former head of B-Dienst. When told about Ultra, he sat in silence for several minutes before saying, "Then we never had a chance. From the moment you broke Enigma, the war was lost. Everything else, the battles, the tactics, the sacrifices, was just delay." The ultra-secret remained protected by the Official Secrets Act until 1974, creating one of the most successful security operations in intelligence history. Over 10,000 people who had worked at Bletchley Park maintained absolute silence for nearly 3 decades. They returned to civilian life, unable to explain gaps in their employment history, forbidden from discussing their wartime service even with spouses, and forced to listen to incorrect historical accounts of the war without correction. The secret's preservation served multiple purposes. During the immediate post-war period, British and American intelligence services were using captured Enigma machines to establish secure communications with developing nations who believed they were receiving state-of-the-art encryption technology. More importantly, the techniques developed at Bletchley Park were being applied to Soviet communications during the Cold War, and revealing these capabilities would have compromised ongoing operations. The human cost of this silence was significant. Brilliant cryptanalysts returned to academic positions without recognition for their groundbreaking work in computer science and mathematics. Women who had operated the Bombes and Colossus machines, performing work that laid foundations for the computer age, were unable to claim their place in technological history. Veterans who had served at Bletchley Park faced skepticism about their war service, unable to provide details about their contributions. Gordon Welchman, who had developed the diagonal board modification that made the bomb machines truly effective, emigrated to the United States and worked in classified research. When he finally published his memoir, The Hut 6 Story, in 1982, he faced threats of prosecution under the Official Secrets Act, despite the general declassification of Ultra. He died in 1985, finally able to claim credit for innovations that had helped win the war, but facing official censure for revealing operational details. The dam finally broke in 1974 when Group Captain F.W. Winterbotham published The Ultra Secret. Winterbotham, who had overseen the special liaison units that distributed Ultra intelligence, had fought for years to tell the story. His motivations were complex: personal vindication, historical accuracy, and concern that crucial lessons about intelligence and warfare were being lost. The book's publication sent shockwaves through the historical community and surviving German military leadership. Historians suddenly had to revise their entire understanding of World War II. Battles that had been attributed to brilliant generalship or lucky reconnaissance were revealed as intelligence operations. Allied commanders who had seemed prescient were shown to have been reading their enemy's mail. For German veterans, the revelation was devastating. General Adolf Galland, former commander of the Luftwaffe fighter force, reportedly said, "For 30 years I have been wondering how the Allies always seemed to know where we would be. Now I know, they were reading our orders before we were." Admiral Dönitz's reaction was particularly complex. In his hastily written response to Winterbotham's publisher, he claimed to have always suspected communications compromise. But this claim contradicted his own war diary, his post-war memoirs, and the testimony of subordinates who confirmed his absolute faith in Enigma throughout the war. The psychological need to retroactively claim suspicion revealed the depth of the wound to professional pride. The most dramatic confrontation with the truth came at a 1978 intelligence history conference in Germany, where former adversaries met publicly for the first time. The conference, hosted by the German Marine Institute, brought together British cryptanalysts from Bletchley Park and German intelligence officers who had operated Enigma systems. The keynote session featured Harry Hinsley, former Bletchley Park analyst and official historian of British intelligence, facing Wilhelm Trano and other B-Dienst veterans. Hinsley's presentation methodically destroyed every German assumption about their wartime security. He showed decoded messages, explained cryptanalytic techniques, and revealed the scale of Allied code-breaking operations. The German response was a mixture of professional admiration and personal devastation. Trano, maintaining his composure, asked technical questions about British methods, clearly impressed by the mathematical elegance of the attacks. But when discussion turned to operational consequences, emotions erupted. The most heated exchange came when Otto Kretschmer, Germany's most successful U-boat commander, confronted former Dönitz staff officers who were still defending their wartime decisions. When they presented the steamroller theory, that German strategy was designed to force the Allies to commit maximum resources regardless of intelligence, Kretschmer exploded. Steamroller? We were sending men to their deaths in operations the enemy knew about in advance. Every patrol order, every tactical innovation, every desperate attempt to turn the tide, they knew it all. And you still defend this as strategy? The confrontation nearly became physical before conference organisers intervened, but Kretschmer's outburst voiced what many German veterans felt. They had been betrayed not by enemies, but by their own leadership's refusal to consider the possibility of cryptographic compromise. In the years following Ultra's revelation, German cryptographers conducted extensive post-mortems on Enigma's failure. What they discovered was both reassuring and disturbing. The system itself remained mathematically sound, but human implementation had created fatal vulnerabilities. The Polish breakthrough in 1932 had exploited a procedural weakness. The Germans transmitted the message key indicator twice at the beginning of each message. This redundancy, intended to ensure accurate reception, provided the mathematical relationship that allowed Marian Rejewski to reconstruct the internal wiring of Enigma rotors using permutation group theory. By the time Germans eliminated this practice in 1940, the Poles had already shared their knowledge with the British. The British success built on Polish foundations but required massive technological innovation. The Bombe machines designed by Turing and Welchman exploited the fact that no letter could encode to itself, a fundamental characteristic of Enigma's design. By testing possible rotor positions against known or guessed plaintext, cribs, the bombs could eliminate impossible settings at electronic speeds. German security procedures, though elaborate, actually aided British cryptanalysis. The prohibition on repeating rotor positions for consecutive days meant British cryptanalysts could eliminate yesterday's settings from consideration. Strict formatting requirements for military messages provided predictable cribs. Weather reports always began with the same phrases, supply requests followed standard formats, and daily situation reports contained repetitive elements. Most damningly, German confidence in Enigma led to poor operational security. Messages were transmitted containing information that appeared in other, less secure communications. When B-Dienst broke British convoy codes, German U-boat headquarters would transmit British convoy positions through Enigma, providing perfect cribs for British cryptanalysts who knew their own convoy locations. Military historians have spent decades analysing Ultra's impact on World War II's outcome. Sir Harry Hinsley's official assessment that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years, and possibly 4, has become the consensus view. But the implications go far beyond temporal calculations. Ultra fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. For the first time in history, one side could consistently read its opponent's most secret communications in near real time. This wasn't tactical advantage, it was strategic omniscience. Every German offensive from 1941 onwards faced opponents who knew their plans, strength, and often their specific objectives days or weeks in advance. The Battle of the Atlantic provides the clearest measure of Ultra's impact. Historians calculate that Ultra intelligence saved between 300 and 500 merchant ships, approximately 1.5 to 2 million tons of shipping. Without these losses, Britain would have faced starvation by mid-1941. The ability to route convoys around wolf packs meant the difference between British survival and German victory. In North Africa, Ultra intelligence allowed Montgomery to fight the Battle of Alam el Halfa with perfect knowledge of Rommel's plans. He positioned his forces exactly where Rommel intended to attack, creating killing fields that destroyed German armour before it could manoeuvre. At El Alamein, Montgomery knew German fuel supplies, tank strength, and defensive positions to the individual vehicle level. The Normandy invasion succeeded partly because Ultra revealed exactly what German commanders believed. Every German intelligence assessment concluding the invasion would come at Calais was read by Allied planners, who adjusted their deception operations accordingly. German reinforcement orders were known before local commanders received them, allowing Allied forces to interdict before German units could reach the front. The most tragic aspect of German ignorance about Ultra was the human cost. Hundreds of thousands of German servicemen died in operations doomed from conception because their orders had been decoded before they received them. U-boat crews suffered the highest proportional losses of any German service, 75% casualties among the 40,000 men who served. They sailed into battles where Allied forces knew their exact positions, their fuel states, their torpedo loadings, and their intended targets. They fought with incredible bravery against impossible odds, never knowing the odds were impossible because their enemies could read their mail. Luftwaffe pilots flew into ambushes prepared days in advance. Transport aircraft carrying desperately needed supplies to encircled forces were intercepted with such regularity that crews called themselves flying coffins. Fighter units found Allied bombers consistently avoiding their patrol areas while striking undefended targets, not through lucky reconnaissance, but through decoded deployment orders. Wehrmacht soldiers fought battles where their opponents knew their strength, their objectives, and often their exact time of attack. The destruction of entire divisions in Tunisia, the collapse of carefully prepared defensive lines in Italy, the failure of every major counter-offensive from Kursk to the Ardennes, all were influenced by Allied foreknowledge through Ultra. For German military professionals who learned about Ultra in 1974, the psychological impact was profound. Their entire understanding of the war required revision. Defeats attributed to material inferiority or tactical errors were revealed as intelligence failures. Heroes who had died making desperate attacks had been sailing or flying into traps prepared by enemies reading their orders. General Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of blitzkrieg warfare, wrote in a private letter discovered after his death, "Learning about Ultra was like discovering your entire life was a stage play where everyone knew the script except you. Every decision I made, every order I gave, every plan I developed, the enemy knew it all. We were not generals commanding armies. We were actors performing for an audience that knew our every line." For Admiral Dönitz, who lived until 1980, the revelation coloured his final years. Associates reported he became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours recalculating old battles with the new knowledge that his communications had been compromised. His final manuscript, never published, reportedly contained extensive revisions to his understanding of the U-boat war, acknowledging that no amount of submarines or tactical innovation could have succeeded against an enemy reading every order. The psychological impact extended beyond military leaders to ordinary veterans. U-boat survivors formed support groups to process the knowledge that their service had been doomed by communications intelligence rather than military failure. Luftwaffe pilots revised their understanding of why they had been consistently outnumbered at crucial interception points. Wehrmacht veterans realized their sacrifices had been magnified by intelligence failures at the highest levels. The German failure to detect Enigma's compromise offers profound lessons about institutional blindness and the dangers of absolute certainty. The Wehrmacht's investigation apparatus was sophisticated, thorough, and staffed by intelligent, dedicated professionals, yet they failed completely because they couldn't question fundamental assumptions. Every investigation started with the premise that Enigma was secure. Evidence was interpreted through this lens, with alternative explanations forced to fit the predetermined conclusion. When multiple supply ships were destroyed at remote coordinates, investigators looked for spies, radar, and reconnaissance rather than considering communications compromise. When convoys consistently evaded wolf packs, they blamed Allied air coverage rather than questioning whether patrol positions were known in advance. The compartmentalization that protected Enigma also prevented comprehensive security analysis. Cryptographers assured operators the system was unbreakable through mathematical proof. Operators assured commanders that procedures were properly followed. Commanders assured high command that security was maintained. Nobody had responsibility for questioning the entire system, and anybody who did faced institutional pressure to conform. German technical pride became a vulnerability. The belief that German engineering and mathematics were superior to Allied capabilities created blind spots. When evidence suggested otherwise, convoys evading with impossible precision, supply ships caught at remote coordinates, the response was to look for even more complex explanations, rather than accept that the Allies might have superior cryptanalytic capabilities. Throughout the war, Germans received warnings they consistently dismissed or misinterpreted. Each represented an opportunity to discover the truth that institutional blindness prevented them from seeing. In February 1942, the German naval attaché in Tokyo reported that the American Navy seemed to have foreknowledge of Japanese operations. The Germans dismissed this as Japanese excuse-making for their Pacific defeats, never considering that if Americans were reading Japanese codes, they might also be reading German ones. Swiss intelligence warnings in August 1943 were explicit. German naval codes were compromised. The German response was to investigate the source of Swiss information rather than the substance of their warning. They concluded the Swiss had been fed disinformation by Allied intelligence, never considering that neutral Swiss observers had simply noticed the obvious pattern of Allied foreknowledge. Even within German intelligence services, suspicions were systematically suppressed. When B-Dienst analyst Lieutenant Friedrich noted statistical impossibilities in convoy routing patterns, his report was buried with a note that mathematical analysis alone cannot determine intelligence sources. When U-boat commanders reported that convoys seemed to anticipate their positions, they were told to maintain better radio discipline rather than question whether their messages were secure. The greatest irony of the Enigma story lies in the German B-Dienst's success. While Germany remained blind to Enigma's compromise, B-Dienst successfully broke numerous Allied codes throughout the war. They read British convoy codes, American diplomatic traffic, and Soviet military communications. This success should have taught them that codes could be broken, that communication security was always vulnerable, that cryptanalytic success was possible with sufficient resources and determination. Instead, their success reinforced their blindness. German cryptanalysts knew how difficult code-breaking was, how many resources it required, how often it failed. They projected their own limitations onto the Allies, assuming that if Germany struggled to break Allied codes despite massive effort, the Allies must face even greater challenges attacking the superior Enigma system. Wilhelm Trano's success reading British convoy codes convinced him he understood the limits of cryptanalysis. He knew that even with captured codebooks, maintaining continuous access required constant effort and frequent failure when codes changed. He couldn't imagine the Allies had industrialized the process, turning cryptanalysis from art to science, from individual genius to mass production. The B-Dienst's tactical successes ultimately contributed to strategic failure. Reading convoy codes allowed precise positioning of wolf packs, but these positions were then transmitted through Enigma to U-boats, providing perfect cribs for Bletchley Park. German tactical intelligence victories accelerated their strategic intelligence defeat. After Ultra's revelation in 1974, German military historians undertook comprehensive reassessments of World War II operations. The results were devastating to traditional narratives of German military competence and Allied material superiority. The Afrika Korps defeats in North Africa, previously attributed to supply difficulties and Allied numerical superiority, were revealed as intelligence operations. Rommel's supplies were interdicted because the Allies knew exactly when and where supply ships would arrive. His tactical innovations failed because Montgomery knew his plans before German division commanders received them. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, was reconsidered in light of ultra-intelligence. Soviet forces knew the exact timing, strength, and objectives of the German offensive weeks in advance. What appeared as brilliant Soviet defensive preparation was revealed as foreknowledge through British-supplied ultra-intelligence, laundered through the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland. The failure of the Atlantic Wall to stop D-Day was reinterpreted knowing that every German defensive preparation was known to Allied planners. Rommel's obstacles, Rundstedt's reserve positions, Hitler's strategic assumptions, all were transparent to an enemy reading their most secret communications. The Atlantic Wall hadn't failed because of Allied material superiority, but because its every weakness was known and exploited. Even German victories required reassessment. The initial success of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944 occurred partly because bad weather prevented ultra-intelligence from reaching forward commanders in time. When weather cleared and communications resumed, Allied forces knew exactly where German spearheads were heading and could position reserves accordingly. As the 1970s progressed, aging German intelligence officers who learned about Ultra provided invaluable testimony about their wartime blindness. Their accounts, collected by historians before this generation passed away, offer unique insights into the psychology of intelligence failure. Heinz Bonatz, former head of B-Dienst, admitted in a 1979 interview, "We were too clever for our own good. We knew so much about cryptanalysis that we couldn't imagine anyone knowing more. We saw patterns that suggested compromise but explained them away with increasingly complex theories. The simple truth, they were reading our messages, was too terrible to contemplate." Dr. Erich Hüttenhain, the Wehrmacht's chief cryptanalyst, reflected in 1976. The mathematics were correct. Enigma was unbreakable, given the computational resources we imagined possible. We never imagined the British would devote thousands of people and millions of pounds to the task. We thought like engineers, not like desperate enemies fighting for survival. Otto Kretschmer, the legendary U-boat ace who survived the war after his capture in 1941, provided perhaps the most poignant reflection. "We sailed into death thinking we were warriors. We were actually victims of our leader's blindness. Every patrol was compromised before it began. Every tactical innovation was known to the enemy before we implemented it. We fought with courage against mathematics, and mathematics won." The children and grandchildren of German World War II veterans faced their own reckoning with Ultra's revelation. Many had grown up with stories of heroic sacrifice against overwhelming odds. Learning that their relatives had been systematically deceived by failures at the highest levels of German intelligence created complex emotional responses. Hans-Peter Dönitz, the Admiral's grandson, wrote in his 2003 memoir, "My grandfather went to his grave believing he had done everything possible to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Learning about Ultra forced our family to confront a different narrative, one where his greatest innovation, centralized control through radio, became the instrument of his fleet's destruction. He was not a fool, but he was fooled by his own certainty." Veterans associations struggled to process the implications. The U-Boat Veterans Association, Verband Deutscher U-Boot-Fahrer, held special sessions in the 1970s and 1980s where historians explained Ultra's role in the Battle of the Atlantic. Many veterans initially rejected the information, unable to accept that their sacrifices had been magnified by intelligence failures. Others found strange comfort in learning that their defeats weren't due to personal failures, but to systematic compromise at the highest levels. The story of Enigma's compromise influenced post-war German cryptographic development in profound ways. The Bundeswehr, established in 1955, implemented communication security protocols specifically designed to prevent another Enigma-style intelligence catastrophe. German cryptographers abandoned the assumption of cryptographic invulnerability, instead assuming all communications could potentially be compromised and implementing defensive measures accordingly. Multiple encryption systems were used simultaneously, with critical information fragmented across different channels. Radio silence became standard procedure, except when absolutely necessary, reversing the Wehrmacht's reliance on continuous communication. The psychological impact on German intelligence services persisted for decades. The BND, West Germany's intelligence service, operated with almost paranoid communication security, sometimes hampering operations through excessive caution. The trauma of Enigma created an institutional culture that assumed compromise rather than security. Professional military historians spent the decades following Ultra's revelation completely reconsidering World War II's European theatre. Battles previously analysed for tactical lessons required complete reinterpretation, knowing one side had consistent intelligence superiority. The German General Staff's vaunted operational excellence appeared less impressive when their opponents knew German plans in advance. The Wehrmacht's early victories from 1939 to 1941, achieved before consistent ultra-intelligence, stood in stark contrast to systematic defeats from 1942 to 1945, when Enigma was thoroughly compromised. Individual German commanders required reassessment. Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox survived partially intact. His tactical brilliance remained even when strategically compromised by Ultra. But others, particularly Dönitz, saw their historical standing diminished. His innovative wolfpack tactics and centralized command, once considered revolutionary, were revealed as fatal vulnerabilities that accelerated defeat. Allied commanders also required reassessment. Montgomery's methodical approach at El Alamein appeared less cautious, knowing he had complete intelligence about German positions and strength. Eisenhower's broad front strategy seemed more reasonable given ultra-intelligence about German reserves and intentions. What appeared as generalship was often intelligence advantage. Despite extensive post-war analysis, one mystery persists. How did German intelligence, generally competent and occasionally brilliant, fail so completely to detect Enigma's compromise despite overwhelming evidence? The answer lies not in individual failure, but in systemic blindness created by multiple reinforcing factors. Computational certainty became dogma. Technical pride prevented consideration of Allied superiority. Institutional momentum suppressed individual doubts. Compartmentalization prevented comprehensive analysis. Alternative explanations, however unlikely, seemed more plausible than accepting total communications compromise. Most fundamentally, the psychological cost of accepting Enigma's compromise would have been unbearable. It would mean every operational plan was known to the enemy, every tactical innovation was compromised before implementation, Every order sent thousands of men to predictable death. The human mind rebels against such terrible knowledge, finding any alternative explanation preferable to confronting systematic, comprehensive failure. In 1979, 5 years after Ultra's revelation and 1 year before his death, Admiral Karl Dönitz gave his final interview about the intelligence failure that had destroyed his U-boat fleet. Aged 88, the last Führer of the Third Reich had spent 5 years wrestling with the knowledge that his every command had been transparent to his enemies. "You ask if I suspected," he said, his voice still carrying traces of Prussian authority. "Of course I suspected. We all suspected something, but suspicion and knowledge are different things. To suspect the enemy has advantages is military prudence. To know your every thought is revealed to him is madness." He paused, looking out the window of his Aumühle apartment at the peaceful German countryside, so different from the Atlantic battleground where his men had died. Could we have won if we had known? Number. By the time Enigma was thoroughly broken in 1941, the war's outcome was determined. But we might have lost differently. We might have saved lives by changing tactics, by accepting defensive positions, by acknowledging reality instead of fighting phantoms. The greatest tragedy, he continued, was not that we lost, but that we never knew why we were losing. We blamed technology, resources, air power, everything except the truth. 30,000 of my men died in submarines, many in operations the enemy knew about before my commanders received their orders. They died bravely, fighting an enemy who could read our thoughts. His final words on Ultra carried the weight of bitter experience. In war, the greatest enemy is not the opposing force, but your own certainty. We were certain Enigma was secure. That certainty killed more of my men than all the depth charges and aircraft in the Allied arsenal. The final accounting of Enigma's impact can be measured in stark statistics that reveal the magnitude of German blindness. Enigma machines and security. Over 100,000 Enigma machines produced between 1920 and 1945. 159 quintillion theoretical configurations for the 3-rotor Wehrmacht version. 10 to the 23rd power possible configurations for the 4-rotor naval M4 variant. Daily key changes requiring new solutions every 24 hours. Over 1,200 different radio networks using distinct Enigma keys by 1944. The breaking operation Polish Cipher Bureau broke Enigma initially in December 1932. Bletchley Park operational from August 1939. Peak staff of 9,000 personnel by January 1945, 80% women. 200 bomb machines operational by war's end. 10 Colossus computers built, world's first programmable electronic computers. Daily intercept capacity, 5,000 plus messages by 1944. Average time from intercept to decoded intelligence, 2.5 hours by 1945. German losses attributable to Ultra. 783 U-boats lost from 1,162 commissioned, 67.4% loss rate. 30,000 submarine personnel killed from 40,000 who served, 75% casualty rate. 41 U-boats lost in May 1943 alone, Black May. 14.67 million tons of Allied shipping saved through convoy routing. 500 plus merchant ships saved by evasive routing based on Ultra. 76,875 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed. Ultra contributed to targeting. 237 U-boats lost in 1943, peak year of Ultra effectiveness. German investigations that failed, 15 plus major security investigations between 1941 and 1945. 3 separate attempts by B. Dienst to break their own naval Enigma, all failed. 5 different alternative theories pursued: radar, infrared, direction finding, spies, traitors. 0 investigations that seriously considered Enigma compromise. One explicit warning from Swiss intelligence, August 1943, dismissed. Multiple internal suspicions suppressed at various command levels. Post-war impact, 30 years of absolute secrecy maintained, 1945 to 1974. 10,000 plus Bletchley Park personnel maintained silence. Hundreds of historical accounts required complete revision. Estimated war shortened by 2 to 4 years, according to official historians. Thousands of German veterans forced to reconceptualize their service. The story of German blindness to Enigma's compromise offers timeless warnings about the dangers of absolute certainty in intelligence and security matters. It demonstrates how competent, intelligent professionals can miss obvious truths when institutional blindness reinforces comfortable assumptions. Modern intelligence services study the Enigma failure as a cautionary tale. The US National Security Agency includes it in training programs about cognitive bias and security assumptions. The British GCHQ uses it to teach the importance of challenging fundamental premises. Military academies worldwide analyze it as the supreme example of intelligence failure despite overwhelming evidence. The German failure wasn't technological. Their cryptographic mathematics were sound. It wasn't procedural. Their security protocols were elaborate and generally well executed. It wasn't intellectual. German cryptanalysts were among the world's best. The failure was psychological and institutional. The inability to question fundamental assumptions despite mounting evidence they were wrong. In our modern age of cyber warfare and electronic surveillance, the Enigma story carries renewed relevance. Every system assumed secure, every communication believed private, every encryption considered unbreakable should be questioned with the knowledge that somewhere, someone may be reading what was meant to be secret. The Germans' certainty in Enigma killed thousands and prolonged a war. Similar certainty in modern systems could prove equally catastrophic. Today, Bletchley Park stands as a museum to one of history's greatest intelligence triumphs and Germany's greatest intelligence failure. The huts where young men and women broke the unbreakable cipher are preserved, the Bombe machines reconstructed, the story finally told after decades of silence. Visitors walk through spaces where mathematical genius combined with industrial organization to achieve what German experts considered impossible. They see the cramped conditions where thousands worked in absolute secrecy, knowing they held war-winning intelligence but unable to speak of it even to family members. They learn how an eccentric collection of mathematicians, linguists, chess players, and crossword experts industrialized cryptanalysis and changed warfare forever. But perhaps the most powerful exhibit is the simplest, an actual 4-rotor naval Enigma machine, captured from U-505 and displayed in working condition. Visitors can encode messages, watching the rotors turn and lights illuminate, seeing the same mechanical precision that convinced German cryptographers of absolute security. They can understand how something so complex, so mathematically sophisticated, so carefully protected, could still be broken by determined enemies with sufficient resources and imagination. The machine stands as a monument to a simple truth. In intelligence and warfare, as in life, the greatest danger comes not from what we don't know, but from what we're certain we do know that proves to be wrong. The Germans were certain Enigma was secure. That certainty, more than any Allied weapon or strategy, ensured their defeat. In the guest book at Bletchley Park, among thousands of entries from visitors worldwide, one stands out. Written in neat German script in 1995, it reads, "My grandfather commanded U-604, lost with all hands in August 1943. For 50 years I believed he died fighting overwhelming Allied technology. Now I know he died because his orders were read by enemies before he received them. The tragedy is not that Germany lost, but that we never knew we had already lost. The heroes of Bletchley Park deserve our respect, but the lesson of Enigma deserves our constant remembrance." It is signed simply, "A German grandson who finally understands." The story of how Germans never knew the Allies had cracked Enigma is ultimately a story about the frailty of certainty, the danger of institutional blindness, and the devastating cost of refusing to question fundamental assumptions. It reminds us that in intelligence, in war and in life, the most dangerous enemy is often our own unexamined certainty about what we know to be true. The 30,000 German submariners who died beneath the Atlantic waves, the thousands of Luftwaffe pilots shot from skies where enemies knew they would be, the Wehrmacht soldiers who fought battles orchestrated by opponents reading their orders, all were victims not just of war, but of an intelligence failure so complete that it remained hidden from those who most needed to know it. The secret of Ultra was kept for 30 years after the war ended. But the greater secret, how German certainty in their security blinded them to obvious compromise, offers lessons that remain relevant as long as nations keep secrets and assume their communications are secure. The Enigma machine, once the pride of German cryptographic ingenuity, now stands as history's greatest monument to the danger of absolute certainty in an uncertain world. The Germans never knew. That ignorance, maintained despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, represents one of history's most consequential intelligence failures. In the end, the Allies didn't just break Enigma, they broke it while maintaining such perfect secrecy that their enemies never suspected their thoughts were an open book. That achievement, preserved through the silence of thousands and the careful choreography of deception, stands as perhaps the greatest intelligence victory in the history of warfare. The story ends where it began, with an old admiral in 1974 holding a book that revealed truths that destroyed everything he had believed about why he lost the war. Karl Dönitz's stunned silence that day was not just for the men he had lost, or the war that had been doomed from the moment Enigma was broken. It was the silence of recognition, that certainty itself had been the enemy, and that in war, as in life, what we don't know can destroy us more surely than any enemy we can see.